China is one of the 21st century's most consequential nations. It has never been more important to understand how the country is governed and what its leaders and its people actually want and believe. Welcome to Pekingology, the podcast that unpacks China's evolving political system and the trajectory of China's domestic and foreign policy. I'm your host, Henrietta Levin, Senior Fellow with the Freeman Chair in China Studies at CSIS. This is Pekingology. China's economy is complicated. It is generating incredible world-leading advances in green technology, industrial robotics, artificial intelligence. It is also an increasingly difficult place for everyday people to make a living and achieve even modest upward mobility. And these seemingly contradictory trends are quite deeply linked to each other. So to unpack China's dual-track economy, I am really pleased to be joined today by Alicia García-Herrero, a leading expert on Chinese and Asian economics. Alicia recently published a fantastic article in China Leadership Monitor titled China's Dual Economy, When Strategic Ambition Hollows Out the Foundation. Alicia, thank you so much for coming on the show.
My great pleasure.
So how did you first get interested in China?
Great question. I was actually living in the U.S., working for the IMF, started Chinese at the State Department, I still remember, leaving the IMF, running there with a Japanese friend of mine, and she did so much better than me for obvious reasons. But I was fascinated by a country that really looked historically so self-contained, but at the same time so important for the world. That duality, in a way, of a country that at the time had entered barely, actually not yet, negotiating the entry to the WTO. I'm very old. That was 94. And then I'm not a so-called sinologist, I'm an economist. I was at the time traveling to Latin America, to the ex-Soviet Union, and then I left and I lived in Spain for a while and then finally worked for that project, the European Union. I eventually ended up in Hong Kong, then a little bit Shanghai, back to Hong Kong, now Taiwan. But I was always, throughout these years where I was doing something else, always surprised by China's intent. And I think intent is the word for that article, is that we economists, we keep on thinking the economy is everything that matters. And without economic growth, what can China do? And the reality is that that's not China's ultimate objective. The intent is elsewhere. So with this article, I was trying to indeed explain that maybe we, by always measuring China in terms of those targets that have been there for so long, growth targets, we may be missing the point. And China might be doing well elsewhere, even at this point of economic development, maybe at the cost of the economy. And doing that for a reason, not because they can't do otherwise, but because they want to prioritize other objectives, and that's ultimately hegemony. So that's the title of the paper, indeed. Yeah.
And so diving into the dual economy, I'm going to quote at slight length part of your piece because I think you draw out the distinctions here really elegantly. And you say that the dual economy is, on one side, brilliant and purposeful, pushing China to the frontier of electric vehicles, artificial intelligence, solar technology, and advanced semiconductors. The other side, stagnant, squeezed, and increasingly hollowed out. On one side stand China's global corporate champions who keep on winning market share across the world, thanks to China's industrial upgrading. On the other side sits the Chinese households, whose disposable income is no longer growing and whose wealth has been devastated by the collapse of the property market. So how has China's economy come to be characterized by such dissonance?
So I would argue that from the very beginning, this model that now is clearly dual. Yeah, you look at Chinese exports as opposed to Chinese consumption. Everybody can relate to the concept of duality. It's not only China in a way. We hear a lot about the K-shape economies of Taiwan or Korea. But I'm going to argue we're talking about a very different thing. When we talk about K-shape, it's mostly income distribution, like those in the right sectors, whether it's ICT, AI, doing increasingly well, and then the rest of the economy or the workers, their labor share going down, as we economists say. No, China is different. For China, the bulk of the workers is actually subsidizing, and I'll explain that in more detail, subsidizing that industrial upgrade. So it is different. It's not the same K-shaped economy of the rest of the world. So why is this the case, or how can this be? First of all, because China's saving ratio is by far the highest in the world. Some people like to compare China to Japan, whether it's deflation, whether it's export-driven growth. Actually, when you look at the details, Japan never had.
And this is Japan in the 80s.
Not even. Japan in the 80s had the saving ratio that China has had throughout these decades. So it's not only like a single point, it's like the whole average is much higher. We're talking about probably 10 percentage points higher. So that excess saving has actually, it comes also with very low returns on that saving, as it couldn't be otherwise. But even Japan's low returns happen once the bubble collapsed and deflation. No, China has had low returns on savings from the beginning. So that very easy funding of this massive industrial policy has been happening for decades. I think that's very different for China. The labor share, which means the amount of GDP that is allocated to labor compared to capital, is tiny in China. It's around 30%. It's actually half of the US. So why is this the case? Because again, wages throughout, there was a little bit of a blip with Wen Jiabao after the global financial crisis to kind of push up consumption, which didn't work, but there was an attempt to do that. But other than that, wage growth in China has been minimal compared to their actual growth of GDP. So throughout these decades, not now, but throughout these decades, actually labor has been subsidizing capital, if you want, or making capital operate to become industrially more developed. So what I'm saying in that title is not new. It's a feature of the Chinese economy. And why it's now more serious is because I think at this point in time, the ultimate objective is different. So if you tell me what was the objective in the early 2000s, well, it was to bring a huge chunk of the population out of poverty, urbanizing, bringing all of these people from the rural areas, giving them jobs. Yes, maybe wages were not growing, but there was this inclusion. Growth was more inclusive because they were urban. Now it's all about hegemony. It's about the upper part of that technological upgrade. When you go to that level, more and more people fall behind, because it's like a pyramid. It is much more automated, and therefore the benefits for the labor force are smaller, because there's fewer people involved. So I think that is when that dichotomy becomes more harmful for households. Just to give you a sense of what all of this means is that for China to excel in moving up the ladder, export their way out, creating these giant companies globally, they need to sell overseas. How do they sell? They basically lower prices to increase their market share. To do that, what happens is that their profit margin goes down and they have less and less profit, fewer profits left to feed their wages. So we find actually that wage growth in China, actual wage growth, not official data, was barely 1% by the end of 2025. It's probably lower now. So we use financial statements, actual data for wages. That means that all of that growth is only going in one direction. It's like the households are getting less and less out of that growth model. So why is China doing this? Because ultimately the objective is that technological upgrade, that moving up the ladder, that technological hegemony. So for any household, the future is quite clear. It is going to be subservient to that objective. So in that regard, I think the lack of the very negative sentiment of Chinese households is explained beyond the real estate. It's them understanding that the China's growth model is not for them. It's for the sake of that hegemony, that technological hegemony. And the companies just can't feed them back, as I said, with profits. So that is why I think this is structural. It's not a cyclical characteristic of the Chinese economy.
So you see the intent of this model of growth as being intended to compete with the United States, achieve what you just called technological hegemony.
Totally.
I think there's another perspective that would say, well, yes, the Chinese economic model is all about new quality productive forces, as Xi Jinping would like to say, but perhaps because Xi and his government genuinely view that as the best vehicle through which to achieve broader economic outcomes. And you don't see it that way.
No, I don't see it that way, because for that second hypothesis to be true, you would need to see productivity at some point increasing massively so that you kind of bring back labor productivity. So imagine, if all of this massive upgrade were to revert into labor productivity, which then brings up wages, you could argue, well, eventually this is going to happen. If you want, the resources are going to go back to the households, for the mere fact that they're becoming more productive. And given that China's population is falling, who cares about temporary unemployment or youth unemployment? Because eventually we will have the right population for our level of development. But the reason why I don't see that happening is that, first, the level of adoption, whether it's automation or AI, is much faster than the rest of the world. It's very, very fast. And to the point that even with a falling labor force, China is actually creating a labor force problem, an unemployment problem beyond youth unemployment at the current juncture. So I don't see how China is going to be able to grow more out of this model. I think what China is able to do, and I think that's their ultimate objective, is to basically conquer the world, or if you want, to achieve hegemony. Once China is in that hegemonic position, I don't think China firmly believes that the U.S. has benefited it massively out of that hegemony, whether it's through hard power, basically, creating these alliances or asymmetric alliances, or that China is also pursuing, or even currency dominance, or you could see a lot of things that China is aiming at obtaining from that hegemony that could change the clock. The clock now is ticking, China is decelerating, China is aging. So if you become the hegemonic power, you can change the rules of the game, you can change standards, you can change. So the clock starts ticking maybe in a different direction, I think China does believe that turning that turning moment where the world becomes, say, China-centric economically and beyond, is a countdown. It's a moment where China can recoup a lot of what may have been lost out of this dual economy.
What are the policy methods by which China sustains this model, this supply-side, tech-heavy, self-reliance-oriented approach to running an economy?
So the first and foremost is that those massive savings I was discussing can't go anywhere. So in other words, either they are deployed inefficiently, but inefficiently for the households because the return is low, but very productively, if you want, for the government because it can deploy them wherever the government wants.
And we're talking about consumer savings.
Consumer savings. Consumer savings are around 80% of the savings. So, it's basically the bulk of it. So this household savings can't go anywhere else. So they are deployed based on the government's objectives.
And that's because of financial repression on the policy
Financial repression, capital controls, and also financial repression in the domestic financial sector. Because even there, the choices for investment are limited, as everybody knows. Which to me, if I push the argument, by the way, explain why the Chinese government has not supported any return of the real estate. Because the real estate sector was actually diverting part of those savings to an unproductive sector, which was the real estate. While I think since the collapse of the real estate, all of the savings are going to bank accounts, wealth management products, all of them then directed to industrial policy, the manufacturing sector, the new production forces, the technological upgrade. So, I think even that decision, to me, the 3 red lines, everything that suddenly stopped that massive bubble in the real estate sector is related to using those savings more productive. So I think this is the number one tool by the Chinese government. And then the other one, if you talk about self-reliance, in any country in the world, self-reliance needs to be imposed upon. Meaning, why would I use, a Huawei phone as opposed to an iPhone? Well, I think China's trick is this nationalism of consumption, which is increasingly pervasive, by which, the domestic products are preferred, and they are preferred because they come with a signaling effect. So that helps a lot, because a lot of the reduction in imports, which explain the massive trade surplus, is really a nationalistic approach to consumption. Whether it's services, you can think of cinema, boxes, brands, you can think of many, many areas where China has managed to use this nationalistic approach to consumption for macroeconomic reasons. So all of that, I think, is part of the way in which China can run this dual economy.
And you mentioned that a big part of the intent of this system is achieving self-reliance.
Yeah.
Especially in technology, but also in a more comprehensive way. China wants the rest of the world to be more dependent on China, less dependent on the rest of the world. But then there's this gaping hole in that self-reliance, which is the dependence on global export markets that this whole model relies on, which seems like a pretty meaningful vulnerability, and maybe one that's taken on greater salience even in thinking in Beijing in the context of the war in Iran, where even though China's done, effectively everything right to put itself in a very strong position on energy self-reliance.
Yeah.
What does that mean if the rest of the world can't buy Chinese stuff? So that seems like an oversight, but one that doesn't seem to cause the kind of discomfort that you see in the party otherwise.
Yeah, I think it is a very interesting question. So basically, why, if you really believe in self-reliant, you become so reliant on exports, in essence? And I think, well, first, there are not many other options, it's either your own consumption or that of the rest of the world. And if you know that you are putting all of your resources on producing goods and upgrading R&D, or you don't have enough resources for the rest. But I think the other reason is that China actually exports with another type of intent. All of this is about intent, which is creating strategic dependencies. Chinese share of global exports is around 15 to 18%, 15%, I believe, of global exports. So China doesn't export 15% of everything, obviously. China does export 90% of global solar panels. Try to diversify away from that. It's impossible. Or China has 90% of refined rare earths or APIs, you name it. So China actually tries to get to a level of control of that supply chain, whatever that might be, silicon wafers, 90 plus, where you can no longer produce whatever needs to be produced with silicon wafers. So that means that you're not so dependent, because the other side cannot walk away. There's nowhere to go. So I think that's the trick, that China intentionally creates strategic dependencies. And frankly, I would do the same if I were them, because if I'm so dependent on the export market, I'd rather dominate the key sectors where I am actually making the revenues, so that nobody can walk away. I think that's China's attempt to reduce that risk of overdependence on exports.
And you mentioned China's dominance of global solar manufacturing.
Yeah.
If you look at some of the glimmering successes of this economic model, a lot of that is found most clearly in the green tech sector, in EVs and new types of battery technology, et cetera. And so I thought it was interesting in your piece, you highlight that even in this sector that has done so well and been prioritized so highly by the Chinese political economy, fully 1/3 of listed Chinese companies in the green tech sector are now what you call zombie firms or companies that cannot generate enough revenue even to cover their interest payments, and they survive on formal or informal subsidies. So why has this happened, and what should we make of it?
Yeah. It's a great question. So if you're not making money, why do you do that? Why would a company...
Wouldn't you rather make money?
Yeah. Why would you try to increase market share, whether globally or domestically, if you don't make any money? Well, because, again, this is China's economic model. Yeah, it's like even if you don't make any money, you have a local government behind, you're the local champion, and your objective is to increase market share because that would eventually save you. Yeah, think about the anti-involution campaign, this idea that this whole problem of having companies selling at a loss needs to be stopped. Which companies are going to disappear? The smaller. Are they going to look at their company's profitability? I doubt. They're going to allow bigger companies to absorb smaller companies. That's the way it's going. So your incentive is to become bigger, not more profitable, but bigger. What do you do then? You slash prices, especially if the banks behind you extend their loans because basically, these banks belong to local governments, if not central, but mostly local governments. They're going to tell them, feed my local champion, because we want this champion to resist this anti-involutionary environment. And on top of that, they will always want to export. Why? Because on average, the margin is double. So the problem is always the local competition. It's not the global competition. It's the local competition. So what will they want to do? To export as much as possible. So there, and you saw that in first half of 2025, export prices in China fell to 10%. So, everybody was trying to export their way out because was the only place where you could make money. What this means to the world is that China's excessive, I won't call it irrational because it's not irrational, it's rational, yeah? But excessive competition actually has an enormous consequence for the rest of the world because their only way to survive is the rest of the world. So whatever happens in China in terms of this dual economy doesn't stop in China. It immediately translates to global imbalances.
So what you're describing is involution, right? Like a word that we now hear a lot about, this kind of unhealthy, aggressive competition that constrains profitability in very severe ways in the Chinese market. And maybe even a year or two ago, Chinese officials were very hesitant to acknowledge anything remotely reminiscent of overcapacity as a problem. Whereas now, at least, you do hear them talking about involution and price wars being problematic. Do you see the government taking any meaningful steps to address the imbalances you're describing?
Well, they took some very specific measures on the solar industry. But my impression is that you cannot artificially lift prices because it just doesn't work. The most obvious way to solve this problem is Schumpeter came up with a solution, not me, and you just need to apply it, though, is to let the most inefficient companies go. That's what you need to do. So all of the percentages of some big companies that we have in another publication, you would need to see that coming down. But it is not coming down. It isn't because there's no market pressure. There's no market pressure because the float, the listed part of these companies is very small in China. It's below 10% on average. So the shareholders cannot cause a correction or even a collapse of a company. So you basically depend on top-down measures to stop that funding from the banks. And that's not happening. And I think the main reason why that's not happening is the consequences on the labor market. So the local ones don't want to see layoffs, and therefore they just keep these companies running. If Chu Rongji were back to life, he would be very disappointed about a self-made problem, which, didn't come from a fully planned economy. But that's where we are. And of course, it's very different. But what I'm saying is that nobody has the guts, if you ask me, to cut the umbilical cord and say, you go, you go, you go, you go. And by the way, and I finish here with adoption of AI and all of the worries that China has on the consequences on the labor market, on job displacement, I can't see any of these anti-involution campaigns really going to the core of the problem, because it's kind of not the right time, yeah? You're not going to create additional unemployment when AI is being adopted across the board, yeah.
So I want to talk more about how AI affects these trends.
Yeah,
but first, just because you mentioned almost in passing the local government incentives and how that structures the involution challenge. Like, how much of this is about the party's personnel system?
Yeah. Well, good question. I guess, local governments are given too many objectives to fulfill. I wouldn't even talk about growth objectives anymore, but employment objectives. At the same time, they need to deploy robots. So, for example, they have, not sure whether this is on, but it was on until last year. They offer rewards for basically installation of robots, so automation of companies at the local government level. So basically you are induced, if you want, you're pushed to automate. But at the same time, they do not want you to lay off workers. So what's the final result is that workers might not be laid off, but they work fewer hours. They take unpaid leave. So the actual wage growth plummets. In other words, because their objectives are contradictory in a way, I think local governments can't do much more than just surviving these objectives in a way, yeah? So maybe they keep labor, but they can't pay high salaries, actually lower and lower, and at the same time they automate. So over time, this problem becomes a bomb, because at some point the companies won't be able to keep all of these workers, which were not productive, and they cannot keep that salaries even if low. So for me, the local governments are now, what are they doing? We saw that, by the way, with the second quarter GDP data, they're cutting on infrastructure. So if you look at the massive reduction in fixed asset investment, minus 5% growth is really never heard of in China. The real trigger was investment in infrastructure, minus 2.8 for the first time. From 8, wow. Why? Because local governments can't, at the same time, keep these companies afloat, and on top of that, even invest in infrastructure. So you see the trade-offs of local governments, I think, are becoming very compelling, very clear, because they need to continue with that dual reality. They need to upgrade, they need to automate. But then they have the second reality, these households, these workers, and they just can't do it all. So what do they cut? Infrastructure now. That's where we are.
And I guess many of those local officials are hoping that they can get promoted on the basis of exacerbating some of these structural tensions before the point where the tensions hit a breaking point. And
correct.
Someone else has come in to take the blame by that point.
Yes, exactly. So they probably realize that the model is kind of unsustainable. Well, it is more sustainable as long as the rest of the world buys all of these products, to be frank, because that brings new revenue, 1.2 trillion in trade surplus, yeah? But they know that's not enough. So you're right. They know they're exacerbating the problem, but at the same time, they cannot get out of that loophole. It is very difficult for the local governments to do that, yeah.
And so you've noted that involution has done incredible damage to wage growth for Chinese workers. And can you just paint a picture of what has that really meant for quality of life for the Chinese middle class?
Well, it's a very good question, because in any other country, if you were to have 5% growth rate and your wages would be growing 1%, which, by the way, is lower than the US or Europe for that matter. So if you think about it, it's like China is growing so much more than anybody else, but its wages are growing so much less than anybody else, any developed economy, even. You would say, why aren't people just jumping on the table and complaining? Because prices, the consumer price index is growing at 1% as well. And if you think about even last year, even less than that, so there was hardly any inflation, 0. So it's like an engineering argument. Okay, you know what? Wages are not growing, so I'm lowering prices. But of course, if you lower prices, companies earn less money, yeah, because the revenue isn't there, so they can't pay the wages anymore. So it's a vicious circle. But I think the response of the government is do not allow for prices to increase. You can see that very clearly now with the Iran shock, because for the first time, producer prices upstream, yeah, so they are very upstream sectors, cement, all of these things depend on energy costs. So those prices finally went up from negative territory, -3%, to over 2.5%, so big. But that increase in prices is not percolating into consumer goods. Why? Because consumers cannot afford it. And the governments are not keen on consumer prices showing that increase. So who is paying the price? Companies. Because they have higher cost, they cannot increase prices. So the involution problem is only worsening. My point here is that you would imagine this is terrible, but because households are confronted with stagnating prices, it is more bearable than we think. Or at least they feel it's more bearable than we think. It is just that nothing is growing, neither their wages nor prices.
Now let's talk about AI.
Yes.
You wrote that China's incredible pace of AI adoption, while in some ways a testament to the success of this model when it comes to national power, will also play into a dangerous cycle of involution, of depressed wages, and low consumption. So why is this?
Yeah. So, when you talk about, compute in the US, everybody worries, energy prices, we need to access critical raw materials that will have additional costs. So it is somehow, at least at the very beginning, it feels inflationary because you have fewer resources to feed the new monster, let's call it, the new compute, the new AI revolution. But in China, this is very different because China is building AI. Of course, their compute capacity is much less, no doubt about it. But the point is, on the one hand, creating enough low-cost energy to avoid that bump in prices. It has enough critical raw materials, rare earth. So the upstream is not a limit. It's not a constraint like in the US. So for them to increase in compute capacity, the only constraint is, frankly speaking, your export controls. And, that's what it is. But beyond that, it's not inflationary. You see what I mean? It's only deflationary because by introducing AI mostly on vertical AI, meaning on automation and AI augmented automation, the only thing you are doing is to reduce the unit cost of production. Yeah? That means basically companies will sell at that lower unit cost because no matter how big we think exports are, still, even in solar panels, 1 out of 4 is exported. The other 3 have to be sold in a market where those workers, which are now automated, need to earn salaries, wages, to pay for that additional unit of production. So it's totally deflationary in China. And therefore, for me, AI only feeds the involution problem in China, which is very different from the US. Maybe the US will end up there eventually once it has solved its constraints, its energy constraints, its rare earth constraints. But China doesn't have those constraints as of now. Energy costs are already lower than the US, or at least heading down compared to the US. So for me, that is clearly why AI will only make this problem, the dual economy issue, bigger.
And some people argue, though, that China's rapid AI adoption actually helps to solve certain difficult social challenges. For example, China has a rapidly aging society, so maybe it's better to automate away certain labor force shortages.
This is going to be interesting because for once I'm going to agree with this. In other words, I did say that AI is making involution worse, and I still hold to that finding, but you always need the counterfactual. What would happen to China without AI adoption? And that's really your question. So we actually ran these 2 scenarios. So we estimated China's growth rate by 2035. 2035 is a very important year, not only the conclusion of the China dream, but it's because that's the year where China will have basically achieved full urbanization, like, say, the level of Japan or South Korea or the US, where no population will move from the rural areas to the cities because it will have been completed at the current rate of urbanization. And why is that important? Because now the collapse or the fall in the labor force is all in the rural areas, which are very unproductive. So you don't notice, it doesn't really lower economic growth because it's like, how can you lower economic growth if they are not being productive? So the key is when the cities start losing labor force. And that happens in our calculations after 2035. So from 2035, because of this massive impact in the cities of the collapse of the labor force, China would actually grow 1% a year only. I know, it's pretty harsh to hear. Will AI mitigate that huge structural deceleration because of aging and depopulation? The answer is yes. Why? Because the increase in labor productivity out of AI will be bigger than the labor displacement. So the bad thing about AI, you displace labor, it can be accommodated by labor productivity. However, so in other words, the estimates for us is like around 2% growth rather than 1%. So double the growth.
I should ask, 5. Just by point of comparison, yes. What do you think China's GDP growth is now?
Around 4%. I don't think it's as low as some analysts say in the US.
So you're predicting, a rather catastrophic collapse.
Yes, I do think China knows this. That's the point. And I think their AI adoption is quest for salvation because they know that's the only way to mitigate massive structural deceleration. However, that's the good news, that they can mitigate it to double. It's not bad. But the social consequences of this massive increase in labor productivity, which means with less labor, overall is positive, but you have less labor employed. I think the social consequences of that will be massive because China will need to deal with something it has never dealt with, which is structural unemployment. What do you do with that? Universal income. And there's a lot of Chinese academics now discussing what to do about this. Basically, continuous reskilling of labor, is that enough? So, all of these questions become central for China. So the benefit of mitigating structural deceleration comes with a large, in my view, social cost, which feeds China's fiscal deficit. So, it is positive on growth, but it's very challenging on its fiscal situation.
I saw an interesting court case recently in Hangzhou in which a Chinese company was required to retain a worker who would otherwise have been made redundant by AI-generated automation. Is that a good policy solution? Do you think we'll see more of that?
I think that's the way forward for China. I think China is going to have every company KPIs, keep your workers. But the companies, again, as I was mentioning, will need to make tough choices on the actual wages or income offered to those workers.
So it's one thing whether you're going to retain a worker, but are you going to pay them a living wage?
Correct. I think China will have very low productivity workers. Some will be very productive, again, AI augmented workers, but there will be very few. And then you will have not basic income from the government, but company-led basic income workers, where the salaries will be very low. But that will massively distort China's kind of social contract. So that is a big challenge for China, in my view, stemming from not only AI adoption, but the decision to put the burden on the companies rather than on the state because of that court decision and beyond. I think that's China's direction towards the labor consequences of AI.
So if you were Xi Jinping for a day, do you see a way in which China can continue to invest in the technological and industrial capabilities it needs to compete successfully with the United States in the near term, while also fostering a stronger sense of economic well-being for everyday people? What would that look like?
In my humble opinion, Xi Jinping has already taken that decision. And the first objective, sorry to say, competing with the US comes first. This is very clear from every latest speech on AI. It's very, very clear that he firmly believes that the second objective can wait, that the gains will come Some, as you were arguing before, believe that it will come through higher wages because, labor productivity. I'm not on that camp, but it doesn't matter. It may come because of dominance. It may come because of sovereign states or basically soft power across the world. It can come in many other ways. And I do think that's his choice. His choice is basically technological upgrade and hegemony. And I have to add that, again, he may feel he has no choice, that the US would otherwise contain China. So that it's not only coming from China's, own interests. I think it's also coming from the fact that they may feel constrained in their choices.
Alicia, thank you so much for coming on the show.
My pleasure.
To learn more about the structural tensions in China's economy, you can read Alicia's new article with China Leadership Monitor, China's Dual Economy, When Strategic Ambition Hollows Out the Foundation. And as always, we would love to hear from our listeners what you thought of today's conversation and what issues you would like to see Pekingology unpack in future episodes. You can send your ideas to pekingology@csis.org. And if you haven't already, please rate, review, and subscribe to the show. We will be back in your feed very soon.
If you enjoyed this podcast, check out our larger suite of CSIS podcasts. You can listen to them all on major streaming platforms like Apple Podcasts and Spotify. Visit csis.org/podcasts to see our full catalog.